Hello, Kinesiology 4120, Strength and Conditioning. Welcome to our first lecture on the biomechanics of resistance training. So today we're going to talk about some basic anatomy terms, some of the introductory biomechanics, different leverages that we need to understand when it comes to creating exercises and utilizing exercises to train different adaptations. Okay, so today we're going to talk about different skeletal muscle and how they contract, how they act on bones to cause movement, how they orient themselves with different types of levers, and how we can utilize different levers to increase or decrease the amount of force that we need to produce within a movement. We're going to look at different planes of movement, look at a little bit of the mathematics and analyzing some of the physics that are utilized within exercise within resistance training, things like power, work, velocity, acceleration, force, things that we need to understand when it comes to creating the applications for our exercises. And then we're going to talk about some different types of implements that we can use within resistance training and how that affects our biomechanics. Okay, so first thing we need to understand is what skeletal muscle is. So skeletal muscle is the muscle that attaches to a tendon and then attaches to a bone to cause bones to move. So don't think about cardiac muscle, don't think about smooth muscle within intestines. These are muscles that cause bones to move, okay, or resist bones from moving. Okay, the origin site is the most proximal attachment point of a muscle. It's the most stable point, and the insertion is the more distal movable point. So right here we see the upper arm, we see the origin site for the long head of the triceps brachii, and then the short and the medial heads of the triceps brachii. This is our origin point. Okay, this is where the muscle originates from. This is the proximal stable position. The distal, more movable position is here on the olecranon process on the ulna. So when we contract or activate the triceps brachii, it causes elbow extension because it pulls on that olecranon process to cause our ulna to move. Similarly, when we look at our thigh, okay, here we have the origin site of rectus femoris, which is on the AIIS, or the anterior inferior iliac spine, and then the insertion point, which is on the patellar tendon down to the tibial tuberosity here. If we look at what happens if we contracted that muscle, the thigh would move forward into thigh flexion, or the knee would extend into knee extension. So understanding that the insertion point will always move towards the origin point is what we need to know for the location of these muscles. So where they cross the joint, where the origin site and where the insertion site is. The side that a muscle crosses a joint, it will cause a movement to that side. So an anterior muscle will cause an anterior movement, lateral muscle will cause a lateral movement, posterior muscle will cause a posterior movement. So muscles cause movement on the side of the joint that they are located, and then they move the insertion point towards the origin point. Okay, that is kind of the basis of these muscles. Okay, muscles also play different roles. We have agonists or prime mover role. This is the muscle that is causing movement. So this muscle is creating movement. It's contracting to make the other bone move, to make the insertion bone move. The antagonist opposes movement, and it does that, and it can do that by slowing movement at that joint. So if I contract my bicep as fast as I can, and then I contract my tricep throughout that movement, my tricep will counter my bicep or slow it down. This allows us to control movement. So the more the tricep relaxes, the faster the bicep can contract. Okay, the more the triceps is active while the bicep is contracting, the slower that movement's going to be. Okay, this allows some more joint control and stability if we can work together with muscles on either side of a joint. We'll talk more about this when we look at applications of training. But agonist causes the movement, antagonist opposes the movement. And then a synergist is a small muscle that will help the agonist perform an action. Okay, so in this case, we have biceps brachii here. We also have brachialis, which is a smaller elbow flexor. When bicep brachii contracts, brachialis will contract to help that movement occur. Okay. Torque is what is a turning effect caused by a force. A torque is what happens at joints. Okay, so muscles produce a force. So a force is a linear application of a force. So forces are linear. Torque is a rotational force or an angular force. So it is a force with a turn, okay, that is turning around a fixed point. Okay. Torque is directly proportional to the magnitude of the force, so how much force is being applied linearly into the lever, as well as the distance away from the axis of rotation that force is being applied. Okay, you should remember this from maybe some of our other courses, but this is a little review. So a muscle will always attach a distance away from a joint. Okay, that distance will be the lever arm distance. Okay, the force applied by that muscle multiplied by the distance that force is applied perpendicularly, okay, so at a right angle, will equal the torque applied on that joint, or the internal torque applied on that joint by the muscle. Okay, this creates a lever system. We can have three different types of lever systems, and they all are composed of three components. The axis or the fulcrum, which is the turning point, the motive force or the muscle force, the force that we impart that tries to cause rotation, and the resistive force. So this could be the mass of a limb. It could also be some object that we're holding in resistance training. Maybe it's a barbell or a dumbbell. This is a resistance that's applied a distance away from the axis of rotation that is trying to cause rotation, okay, onto our limb. How we organize those 3 points, the force of our muscle, the force of the resistance, and the axis of rotation, determines how much force we or our muscles need to apply to create motion. Okay. We classify these based on our arm principle. Okay. Think about it as an arm. Okay. There's a lever within our arm, at our elbow or at our shoulder, at our wrist. Okay. Our axis, our muscle or motive force, and the resistance force. How they're applied determines the class of lever. Okay, so we have our first class lever, which is like a seesaw, okay, where we have the resistance, or our muscle force is applying force on one side, the resistance force is causing force on the other side to create torque in either direction. So either our muscle, which causes positive torque, or the resistance force, which causes the negative torque. If we want to cause motion, our motive force needs to create more torque than the resistive force creates on that system to create movement in a positive direction. Okay, we can also see this at elbow extension, when the triceps brachii is pulling on the olecranon process that we talked about earlier. It pulls on one side of the joint where the mass of the arm is on the opposite side of that joint, creating a first class lever. We also see it with agonist and antagonist muscle contractions, but instead of a resistive force, it's the opposing muscle group. So maybe it's the biceps are pulling on one side, the triceps are pulling on the other. Whichever muscle creates more torque on that system, or whichever force creates a larger torque, will cause motion in the direction of the greater torque. Another example here is our first class level for cervical extension. So this is extending our head. We have our cervical extensors here, the motive force, and we have the resistance, which is our face, or the weight of the front of our head, the anterior portion of our head. We have to counteract those two or create equal torques in order to keep our head level. If we don't create enough torque posterior to our cervical spine, our head will fall forward, okay, because that torque will be greater anterior compared to posterior. Okay, here's another example of that elbow extension torque. See, we have our triceps creating a torque with our muscle force and the distance it's applied perpendicularly, or the moment arm, as well as the moment arm for the resistive force, which is the force of our hand, or the weight of our hand in this scenario. Okay, this lever has a force on one side and a force on the other, which creates a first-class lever or a teeter-totter system. For our second-class lever, we have the axis on one side, we have the resistance force in the middle, and we have our motive force or our muscle force on the farthest side. Okay, this is the ARM, okay, or second-class lever. So in this situation, it's the most advantageous in the way that it allows us to produce the least amount of force to lift or move the most resistance. If you look at it here, it kind of looks like a wheelbarrow. If you've ever tried to move a bunch of bricks or sod or something and you put it all in the wheelbarrow or dirt, you can lift up much more resistance in that wheelbarrow than you could with just your hands with a linear force, because you're able to create greater torque than the resistance because your lever arm distance is larger than the resistance force's lever arm distance, meaning you create more torque. Okay, so this is the most advantageous when it comes to lifting up a resistance. It's also just like a push-up. If we have our axis of rotation, which is our feet against the ground, the resistance is our center of mass, or where all of our weight is averaged, okay, somewhere around our navel or our belly button. And then we have the force of our muscles, or the force of us pushing against the ground. This is just like a push-up. We produce a force to push us up. The resistance is causing a weight that's pulling us down, and we can push up because less resistance is being applied to us compared to just lifting your body weight up, or your entire body weight. So you can compare that to a bench press with your body weight compared to a push-up, a body weight push-up. Which one's easier? The push-up, because the resistance has less torque compared to where our motive force is, or our arms. We also see this when we're pushing off the ground, when we're sprinting and jumping. Okay, we have the motive force of our calf muscles applied on one side with the resistance force of our body weight on the opposite side of that lever, so that we're on the same side of the lever but closer to the axis of rotation. So here's our axis of rotation at the ground and our foot, our body weight in the middle, and our calf muscles being applied further away. That longer moment arm, or this longer perpendicular application of force, means that we create more torque. If you've ever tried to perform a standing calf raise, can you calf raise more than you can squat? Probably, because there's an advantage of torque in this scenario. Okay, our third class lever, our last one, is the most common lever within our body. Okay, this is where the axis is on one point, our motive force is in the middle, and the resistant force is on the end. This is opposite from that second class lever where the resistance was in the middle. Okay, with our motive force in the middle, we will always have to apply more force with our muscle to counter the torque created by the resistance force. So if we look up here at this image of our biceps, that bicep moment arm is very small compared to the motive arm of that weight that we're holding. So 5 pounds is causing a lot more torque than if it was applied closer. Okay, the closer that object is applied, or is applying a torque to the center of rotation, the less torque is being applied. So our muscles always have a less advantage when it comes to torque. This does give us an advantage, however, for range of motion of the distal point, or the further point away from the joint. So when we contract our muscle or we cause motion, that point where our muscle inserts will only have to move a short range of motion to create a larger range of motion of our hand. So our bicep only contracts a small amount, while our arm moves through a great range of motion. And if those happen in the same amount of time, so it takes 1 second to move 1 inch for our muscle, that would be 1 inch per second. If our hand moves, let's call that 30 inches, that's 30 inches per second compared to 1 inch per second. We can create greater speeds at the distal end by only causing a short range of motion of our muscle. So we get an advantage there, but it means we always have to produce more force with our muscle to counter a torque from an external resistance. So we have to work harder to create that motion. We also see it at our knee joint. We have our muscles pulling on one side. We have the axis of rotation here. Okay, so it's causing a third class lever because the foot and the rest of our leg is below. A knee extension, elbow flexion, examples of third class levers. They're very fast moving levers. However, they need a lot more force to create motion. When it comes to torque being applied at a joint, the torque at a joint is going to change based on the angle of the joint. Okay, so think about doing a bicep curl. Okay, something simple like a bicep curl. Okay, it's relatively easy to get the object to move initially. It's very difficult in the mid-range of that movement, and it's pretty easy to get it from the top down. Okay, so that top range of motion is pretty easy. The bottom range of motion is pretty easy, but that middle range of motion is where we stick. That's where it's very difficult to move. If we look at the lever being created, right here, we have a small moment arm for our muscle. We also have a smaller moment arm for our hand, or where that object is. So there's a smaller torque, there's less torque on our joint at these end ranges of motion for elbow flexion. But if we look here, this moment arm, it really hasn't changed much for our muscle, but it's changed a lot for our arm. Okay, that lever is getting longer and longer and longer, or getting the application of the force is getting further away from the center of the joint. We know that torque is equal to the force applied multiplied by the perpendicular distance from where that force is applied. So if this is 1 inch and that is 20 inches, that's going to be 20 times the torque being applied on that joint. So it's going to be very difficult in that mid-range because the torque is greater based on the range of motion. So 5 pounds feels heavier here compared to at the bottom or at the top, because the lever arm or the motive arm changed, the moment arm changed, creating less torque at some range, more torque at other ranges. So we can use this concept to manipulate exercises to make them more challenging or less challenging without changing the weight of the resistance. Okay. So if we think about that load being applied, it's always applied at a distance away, creating a torque at that joint. So now how do our muscles counter that torque? So muscles can only produce force. They create a straight line force, okay, or that tension, and then they're always applied a distance away from the joint center so that they can create a torque, and the direction of the net torque, or adding all the torques together on that joint, add them all together, the direction will give us the direction of motion. So if I have a situation where the muscle's internal moment or internal torque and the motion of the limb are in the same direction, so say my muscle is contracting, creating a positive torque for my bicep, and my arm is moving in that same direction, that would be considered a concentric muscle action. So they're both moving towards the same direction. So the internal force, which is pulling my arm up from my muscle, and the motion is up, concentric muscle action. Now, if the internal muscle moment or the internal joint torque and the motion of the limb are in opposite directions, or they're away from each other, that would be an eccentric muscle action. So that's when I'm trying to contract my bicep, creating that flexion torque, but my arm is extending. So think about that when you're lowering the weight, or if you try to pick up something really heavy and then it slowly starts to overcome your ability to hold it up, your internal torque is less than the external torque, or the external torque has overcome your internal torque and is causing motion in the opposite direction. That is an eccentric muscle action. So concentrics, we create force and motion occurs in the same direction. Eccentric muscle actions, we create torque, but the motion is in the opposite direction, or the external resistance has overcome our internal torque. So think about it as causing and resisting motion. Okay? These torques are also causing forces in multiple directions. So we have a rotary component of our force from our muscle. So when I contract my bicep, it creates a straight line force from insertion towards the origin, because that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to bring the insertion closer to the origin, because muscles can only shorten. Okay, that's going to create a force. Part of that force is going to be applied perpendicular to the joint. Okay, part of it's going to cause that rotation. That rotary component is applied perpendicular to that limb that I'm trying to move. Another part of it is going to be applied linearly through the joint. If it's contracting and causing rotation, and part of it is causing a linear component into the joint, it's caused a stabilization component. So part of the muscle's total force is stabilizing the joint. In some cases, it's causing rotation, and the other is dislocating or causing a linear force that's causing it in the opposite direction of the joint center, or causing the joint to slightly come apart. So we'll talk a little bit about this when it comes to choosing exercise, but some movements have a stabilization point and some exercises have a dislocating component. And sometimes it just depends on the range of motion. So during a bicep curl, initially you have a stabilization component because the muscle is almost pulling the joint together. After you meet halfway and that force is only perpendicular, and you move towards a greater range of motion, now that muscle is pulling the limb up as well as rotating it into flexion, which is causing a slight dislocation component or pulling the joint apart from each other. Okay, so some may be better or worse depending on if we want to have more joint stabilization or less joint stabilization. Depends on the application. Okay, but joint torque is different depending on the angle at which that joint is being placed in flexion, extension, abduction, adduction. Okay, the angle of the joint changes the torque, as well as where the forces are being applied. Okay, the external force could be the weight of your arm. So if you just lifted your arm forward compared to lifting your arm forward with your elbow bent, which one's easier? Okay, obviously lifting it with your elbow bent, because now that external force is closer to the center of rotation, less torque, less work for our muscles. Okay. Other things like ground reaction forces could be applied. So think about when we're pushing into the ground. Okay, the ground will always push back up against us, which can create a torque at our joints. When we take a step forward, we create a torque at our hip because our foot and the rest of our thigh is further away from the joint center where that force is being applied, creates a torque. Okay, torques are everywhere within our movement. We'll talk about how these really are applied in different situations and how we can use them to our advantage to cause a greater adaptation for the performance we're trying to elicit with this exercise. Okay. Next thing we need to understand is planar motion. If you've taken applied kinesiology, you probably understand planar motion. Okay, we have a sagittal plane, a frontal plane, and a transverse plane. Sagittal plane cuts us into side-to-side halves. Okay, that means that we have a left and a right half, frontal plane, front and back halves, transverse plane, top and bottom halves. If a movement occurs within a plane, it is in parallel to that plane. So a sagittal plane movement will go parallel to the forward-backward plane. Frontal plane movements will go parallel to the front and back plane. Transverse plane movements will go parallel to the top-bottom plane. So think of these as forward-backward, side-to-side, and spinning. That's kind of the simplest way to think about it. So things like flexion and extension, forward-backwards movements, sagittal movements. Side-to-side movements like a jumping jack, frontal plane movements. Transverse plane like doing the twist, transverse plane movements. we'll get more into this in lab when we discuss them. We can go through some activities. All right, now we'll go into the physics, some of those mathematical concepts. Here's a quick conversions. We'll use the units of, we might use pounds and kilograms interchangeably, but if we want to, I'll try to use as much as we can in more of our units rather than SI units, but we need to understand both of them. If we're doing any of these calculations, I'm going to use the terms of meters or radians instead of degrees, things like that. Okay, so here let's go through our equations for our physics concepts. A velocity, or a object's rate of change in position, which is displacement is a change in position in a straight line. So point A to point B in a straight line, divided by the time it took that to occur. Velocity is a vector component, which means it has a direction and a magnitude. So velocity can be forward, it can be to the right. Okay. So it has a direction and it has a magnitude or a size. That size is the displacement or change in position over time. So say in a bench press from the bottom position to the top position, how far that traveled in the time it traveled will tell us the velocity of the barbell. Acceleration is velocity divided by time, or the rate of change in velocity. So how fast does velocity change over time? So acceleration is key for us because it means that we are speeding up. Okay, velocity, think of velocity as our speed in a direction. Acceleration is making that speed change. Okay, positive acceleration means we are getting faster. You're pressing the gas pedal harder. Negative acceleration means we are slowing down or bringing that velocity lower. Think of that as hitting the brakes. Okay, changing our velocity over a period of time. Force is also a vector. It has mass, or it's a mass multiplied by acceleration. So it's the amount of mass multiplied by how fast its velocity is changing will equal our force. Or we could say that force divided by the mass will equal our acceleration. Okay? Or the force divided by the acceleration will equal the object's mass. It will work in all of these different directions. Okay, but force is, think about as what we're imparting into the ground or what we're having to absorb, and we have to change its velocity because all objects are in motion and will stay in motion unless acted on by an external force. Okay, so that mass will change its velocity only when a force is applied. We are the ones who are trying to apply forces against external objects when it comes to resistance training. Okay, the next one is work. Work is force times displacement, or the distance of point A to point B in a straight line multiplied by how much force you imparted on that object. So think about that as like moving a sled. Okay, moving a sled from point A to point B in a straight line, that's the displacement multiplied by the force that you imparted on that sled will equal the work that you did. Or think about it from a bench press that example we did earlier. The displacement from the bar at the bottom by your chest to the top is the displacement. Multiply that by the force that you imparted will give you your work. Work is important because work is a component of power. Work divided by time is power. Force times displacement, so force applied over a certain distance divided by how long it took you to apply that force over that distance will equal your power. Power is key in sports performance. Your ability to apply force for a certain displacement or point A to point B. So think about a lineman who hits and pushes. That displacement, the amount of force that you can impart over a shorter period of time means that you have more power. You can also think of this as power is force times velocity, because velocity is displacement over time. Force times velocity is power. So applying force at a faster rate over that distance that you're imparting it or the displacement you're imparting it. So think about hitting a baseball. It's a very short period of time. If you can impart more force in that short period of time, you're going to hit that ball farther. If you're thinking about tennis, same scenario. If we're thinking about two people colliding, maybe two hockey players are hitting each other, the one who can impart that force at a faster rate will have more power and will be more successful within sport. This is our key, and it comes from how fast you can move, how fast you can change your rate of movement, which comes down to the force you apply, how long you apply it for in a time. So force, displacement, and time are our foundational components, and they will give us the physics of sport performance. Okay, we will go through this again in our lab, so if this did not make sense, you can rewatch it again. But our key components here are power equals force times velocity. If force applied in a shorter period of time or applied faster means more power. And more power, more sports performance. Okay, there's some other things when it comes to angular components, so rotation. Some different sports require rotation. They require you to spin. Angular and rotational are the same, so I'll use them interchangeably. Angular displacement or angular change from point A to point B, or rotating from point A to point B in angles is termed in degrees or radians. These are the two units of measure. Okay, 57.3 degrees is 1 radian. 2 pi radians is 360 degrees. Okay. Angular velocity, or how fast something is rotating, comes from angular displacement, or how many degrees it moved over a period of time. Okay, so going from 0 to 180 in 1 second would be 180 degrees per second. This is really key in sports like tennis and baseball. Baseball angular velocity of your arm, so how fast you can rotate your arm, means that you can throw faster if you have a higher angular velocity of your arm. Baseball, volleyball, football, quarterbacks all require high angular velocities when they project an object. And we also have angular work, so this is the angular analog to work that we saw earlier. Torque, a force that is causing rotation, times angular displacement will give us angular work, or how much torque we apply over a displacement, or an angular displacement in this case. We also have angular power, which comes from angular work divided by time, or angular velocity times torque. Okay, so how much torque we can create at a faster angular velocity will create more angular power. More angular power means better sport performance in rotation-based sports, right? So that's kind of our back and forth. Now let's talk about what we mean by strength and power. So sometimes these two get interchanged, these get seen as similar. Strength is the ability to apply force at any given velocity. So it's your ability to apply force onto an object, or apply force in general, okay, at any given velocity. So that could be slow strength, we have faster strength, we have speed strength, strength speed. We'll get into those across our force velocity curve. Power itself is the product or multiplication of force and velocity. Okay, so it's the rate at which work is done. Its power is force times velocity. So how fast we are implying that force, how fast work is being done. Okay, so think about these as sport dependent or movement dependent. So a football lineman compared to a racquetball serve. A strength is your ability to apply force at a given velocity. A football lineman's velocity is much slower than a racquetball serve velocity, which means that the force imparted is going to be different. Okay, having slow strength is probably going to benefit the lineman and not the racquetball player. Fast strength, or the ability to apply force at a really fast velocity, is going to help the racquetball serve to a higher degree than the football lineman. So we'll talk about how these apply in different sports when it comes to their needs for strength and power. Okay, so what causes strength? Why are we strong? What happens? How do we manipulate strength. Okay, there are different factors that cause strength from a biomechanical point of view. We're not even going to go into the physiology yet. Okay, from a neurological component, your motor unit recruitment, or how many muscle fibers you can recruit or turn on to contract, and the rate at which you can cause them to contract, is going to increase your strength. So if you can turn on more muscle fibers sooner, you're going to be stronger. If you can turn on more muscle fibers, you're going to be stronger or be able to impart more force. Force is also related to muscle size. So larger muscles have more muscle or more myofibrils. Yeah, they have more places for muscle to contract and create force. Larger muscles often, not one-to-one, but larger muscles often can produce more force or more strength. Also, joint angle changes. So think it back to those torque questions that we talked about earlier. The joint angle is going to dictate how much force is required by the muscle. So different angles can be stronger or less stronger. This is when we talk about different leverages with movement. We'll talk about these in our lab, how changing body positions can make you theoretically stronger by manipulating torque. And we also have strength to mass ratio. The more lean muscle mass you have compared to body weight, the stronger you can be, because more of your mass can contribute to muscle contraction or force production. And lastly, we have the arrangement of muscle fibers, the angle at which they are moving against that tendon. So different muscles are placed at an angle to your joint. So think about a fusiform muscle, it's tendon to tendon in a very straight line. This muscle can shorten very fast, but it can't fit a lot of muscle fibers. Compared to a multipennate muscle that can fit a lot of fibers in there at an angle, but because they only shorten a short distance, they can't produce the same velocity, but they can produce more force. We'll get more into muscle fiber arrangements in our physiology section on muscle in the neurological system. But the line of pull of the muscle can influence the strength potential. Okay, velocity is the last one that really contributes to strength potential, and this one really applies to sport. We talked about concentric and eccentric muscle action, so your ability to cause motion or resist motion. And isometric is the ability to maintain a position. So force that stops movement, doesn't cause it, doesn't allow it. Depending on the muscle contraction as well as the velocity of movement, this can really influence our ability to create strength. So with concentric muscle actions, as shortening velocity goes down, our potential for force goes up because we have more time to recruit more motor units or more muscle fibers. If we have more time where we're moving slower, we have more time to create more force up to the point where we're not even moving. If we're moving very fast, this is a very short period of time to stimulate muscle contraction and cause it to occur. We can't produce as much force at very high velocities. Okay, that mid-range is where we're trying to push that over. We'll talk more about that later. But if we shift onto the eccentric side of the curve, or we're lengthening velocity, so we're resisting muscle. Think of this as negative velocity. Concentric is causing motion or positive. Lengthening is negative, or eccentric is negative. Okay, the faster negative the contraction is, the higher potential we have for force production. Okay, this is interesting because we get the utilization of our connective tissue that can stretch. Those contractions can hold on. It's easier for us to maintain a contraction and have some elastic stretch than it is for us to cause more contraction. We'll get into that in the physiology. But this is why you can land from a vertical jump with 6 times your body weight worth of force, but you can only lift maybe 1 times your body weight. Okay. We have more capacity to resist motion than we do to create motion. Okay. And we'll get into how we can manipulate this with our exercises to improve our ability to create strength. And what we really care about is improving our ability to create power. power is what's the key to sport performance and life performance, creating force at high velocities. And lastly, we'll talk about some different types of resistance we may encounter. First one is inertial-based resistance, which is gravity. So think about dumbbells, barbells, a sandbag, a kettlebell, something that is a fixed weight, and we are changing torque throughout our movements. But the mass of the object stays the same. We also have things like a weight stack machine where we're using a pulley to lift a weight up. This is another way for us to manipulate gravity and manipulate torque so that we can continue to cause motion. We sometimes have different cam-based weight stack machines, which will have an oblong or kind of an oval shaped movement from where the object is applied onto that cam, which can change the moment arm length for the resistive force, making it more difficult at different joint angles. This is something that you'll see more in like Nautilus equipment, not as much now. You may see it in some gym equipment, but it does change the torque for the resistive force as your joint torque changes. It's not perfect, but sometimes it works. The next one is friction-based resistance. So think about like moving a sled, pulling something against the ground. Okay, that's a great friction-based resistance. The more force we apply down, or more normal force applied to the ground from the resistance we have, the greater the resistance from the friction, harder it is to move, like pulling a sled or pushing a sled. Fluid resistance or different kinds of pressure. If you ever use some kind of pneumatic exercise equipment, you have to push against a pressurized cylinder, makes it more difficult to move. Or we can look at this as swimming, okay, or moving through the water. That's a fluid resistance, and it changes based on the size of the object and the rate at which we move through that fluid. And last one is elasticity, so think about like resistance bands. As we pull on that band or the band gets longer, the greater resistance it has because it wants to shorten, and the greater the amount of elasticity by how far we stretch it or how much strain we put on that object. Okay, so ones that have more resistance to change in their shape have greater elasticity, more difficulty when it comes to resistance. All right, now I have a few review questions for you. I want you to define what is power both mathematically and conceptually. So what is it from a math point of view, and then what is it from a kind of a discussion point of view? Describe the types of levers. Give some examples of movements in each plane. How does muscle fiber arrangement influence force production? How does velocity and muscle action influence force production? And describe the different major types of resistance. Right, this is a great review going into your quiz 1. Right, thank you very much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in lab.